Today we're making Matt Adlard's ultimate chocolate cake, and I've done some changes to this recipe, and that means that this introduction is going to be a little bit different than usual. So if you want to skip ahead just to when we start baking, there's timestamps in the description. Otherwise, the changes I made are that first of all, Matt uses 3 sponge cakes for this recipe, and that means that you would end up with a very big cake. And it also means that if you were to use all 3 of them, the total amount of calories for this cake would be roughly 23,000. So I used 2 cakes instead, or 2 sponge cakes, and I cut one of them in half. And that means that we still end up with a 3-layer cake, but it's something that feels more reasonable to me. It's not that tall, it looks like a regular cake. And I also switched out the vegetable oil to butter. And I don't use buttermilk because buttermilk is not a thing in Sweden, so I just used regular milk. And he also overestimates how much filling you need, so basically you only use half of all the fillings. I made another cake the week after and I used the leftovers and it was still fine, so you have a lot of filling and you don't need that much. He just makes sure that you won't run out. But that means that it's a bit difficult to give an exact number, but I would estimate this if you make it the way I did and use roughly half of all the ingredients, that you would end up with 13,000 calories. And that means that how much calories there are in every portion depends on how big of a piece you get. But if you were to have 16 pieces for this cake, you would get roughly around 800 calories per portion. So, with that said, let's start. And we're gonna start off by adding 83 grams of cocoa powder to a pot. He uses Dutch cocoa powder, so did I. And then we're gonna add 313 grams of water to this. We're gonna heat that up until we start seeing some steam. And then we're just gonna remove it from the heat and let it be until we're ready to mix it in with our other ingredients. So when we have some steam, just remove it from the stove. And it will be fine, left alone. That means we're gonna start with a sponge cake. As I said, we're doing 2 of these instead of 3. So we're gonna be using 520 grams of sugar, 327 grams of flour, and we're adding 2 grams of salt and 25 grams of baking soda. And I know that it sounds like a lot, but it's totally fine and works real well. And Matt in his video says that it's super important that you sieve this and don't skip it, it makes all the difference in the world. So I sieved it, and this took a really long time, and all I did was end up with flour in the bowl and sugar in the sieve because the sugar would not make it through the fine mesh strainer. So my advice is to skip the sugar thing. I don't think it makes any difference at all. If I were to sieve anything, I would just sieve the flour, and I think that's enough. Then we're gonna take butter, 197 grams of butter. We're gonna add 163 grams of eggs, and since I was fairly lucky and got 164, but it's actually important because this is a very wet cake that you end up fairly close to 163 grams. So if you're not there, just whisk them together and just measure eggs from the ones you whisked. Then we're gonna add the milk, we're gonna add our melted butter, and after that it's time to add our wet ingredients with our dry ones. And we're gonna mix that together until we have a smooth batter. And once we have our smooth batter, it's time to add our chocolate. And as you can see, this is going to be a fairly wet cake, so you need to be careful on how you handle it later on, and it's going to be very moist and very nice to eat. And that's our batter. All we need to do now is prepare our mold, which we're going to do with, we're going to be coating it with butter and cocoa powder, and it's a 9-inch or 22 centimeters mold. And then we're gonna add some baking paper to the bottom of this. If your dough, this is very likely going to stick, so don't skip this. And this is easy, just fold it as many times as possible. The more times you fold it, the rounder shape you will have. It's very easy, just fold it as many times as you can and then aim it towards the center and just cut it off, and you will have a perfectly or a round shape that's good enough to put our cake batter on. And then we're going to preheat our oven at 175 degrees Celsius or 350 Fahrenheit. And it's time to weigh our cake batter. And since you used probably the exact same amount as I have, that means that we want 931 grams of batter. If you used any other measurements, then just use half, because we're going to be making 2 of them. And this is going to be in the oven for 45 minutes. I only have 1 of those molds, so I'm going to be doing it in steps. If you have more of them, you can bake 2 at the same time. And now it's time to actually be careful, because we want to remove that, let that sit for like a few minutes, 3 to 5 maybe, just to cool down a little bit. And once that's done, we're gonna take a knife, just run it through the edge of the mold, and then carefully we're gonna flip this cake and try to remove it from the mold. If you shake it a bit, you can see that it's come loose everywhere. So try to remove it from the mold. Hopefully everything goes easy. And once we've done that, we're going to be wrapping this in plastic wrap. You can see the steam coming off, and we want to trap that steam within the cake so it remains as moist as possible. So quickly just wrap this in plastic wrap, and be careful, because since it's so moist, it's actually quite fragile. So you need to be a little bit careful here. A little bit careful here. That means that we're done with our first step. All we need to do is repeat that and just do the same thing for the other cake. And after that, it's time to make our chocolate Cremeux. And for that, we're gonna be adding 180 grams of dark chocolate. Matt's recipe says to use at least, or to use 70% cocoa powder chocolate. I didn't see that, so I used 55, and it was fine. So throughout the recipe, I'm using a 55% cocoa powder chocolate. Then we're gonna be adding our eggs, cream, and milk. And same thing here. If you don't end up where you want with the egg yolks, just whisk them and weigh them afterwards. To that, we're going to be adding 40 grams of sugar and a pinch of salt. And then we're gonna whisk that all together and heat it. And we don't want to use too much heat here, because then you're gonna burn some eggs to the bottom of your pot, so heat this fairly slowly, and we want this to reach roughly 80 degrees Celsius. And once we're there, we are going to sieve this because we're going to end up with some cooked pieces of egg, and we're going to be pouring this onto our chocolate. Mix that together. You can use a hand mixer here. And we're gonna mix that until we have a smooth batter. And then all we need to do now is to cool this. Put this on a baking sheet so it's allowed to cool down. And that's it for our first filling. Once it's cooled down, all we need to do is just place that in a piping bag and put it in the fridge until you're ready to use it. For the French buttercream, we need soft butter, room temperature butter. So we're going to be adding 140 grams of egg yolks. I got some egg whites in there as well, which means that this didn't become quite the consistency I wanted when I whisked it. So here, be careful and only use egg yolks. And this is going to be whisking for quite a while. So if you have a food processor or anything like that, which you can just leave it whisking away, that's probably to prefer. Otherwise you can do it by hand, but then it's tough to do many things at the same time, which you can do otherwise. 140 grams of sugar with 25 grams of water, and we're gonna heat our sugar until it turns 140 degrees. And once we're at 140 degrees, we're gonna add that onto our egg yolks that's been whisking away for roughly 5 to 10 minutes. And we're gonna be pouring that in slowly. If you pour it too slow, the sugar might crystallize and you get sugar crystals, so you need to find a balance here. Not too fast, that you cook the egg yolks, and not too slow, so that the sugar crystallizes. I obviously poured it too slow, as you can see. And to that we're going to be adding our room temperature butter as fast as our bowl is not hot, because we don't want to melt this butter, we want to mix in the butter. So if your bowl is still hot, it's not ready to add your butter. After that, we are going to be melting milk chocolate, and 175 grams of it. It's a lot of chocolate that's used for this recipe. But as I said, I had a lot of filling left over, so I think that you basically can cut all of your fillings in half and you will still be fine. You can make half as much of the chocolate Cremeux and half as much as the French buttercream. But if you want to be safe, use the portions in the recipe. Now, this has been mixing away with our paddle attachment, and that means that it's time for us to add our chocolate into our milk, butter, sugar mixture. Just add that and let it whisk away. And this is lovely, it's super delicious, so I highly recommend you try this. And into piping bags and put it in the fridge. They're gonna firm up really hard, so before you want to use them, you need to get them back to room temperature in order to actually use them. And that means that it's part 3, which is our chocolate ganache. And for that we're gonna need 640 grams of dark chocolate. Also, this was a lot as well. You can cut that in half as well. You don't need that much for this cake. As I said in the beginning, I baked another cake the week after, and I used the remaining ganache we had for that, and it was no problem at all. 40 grams of honey, 85 grams of butter, and then we're going to be adding 40 grams of sugar as well. And we're going to be putting that on the stove on medium heat together with cream, and that's 640 grams of cream. And by now I was running out of pots, so I should definitely have been using a bigger pot than this. It's easier to do the dishes before and use a bigger pot than using the smallest one you have and just hope that everything works out. So bigger pots makes this much easier. Once our chocolate is melted, we can remove that from the heat. And once our butter is melted and that is mixed as well, we need to mix both of them together. And here Matt says that this is going to split and everything, and it's supposed to. It didn't split for me. I don't know if it was that I just mixed it this very, very slowly, but it didn't split. Could also be that I used 55% chocolate and not 77. But if it does split, that's not a problem. Also use bigger pots. If it does split, that's not a problem, because we're going to be adding some sour cream and use our hand mixer, which is going to be emulsify this and make this come together if it has split for you. So if it does, that's not a problem. Anyway, we're gonna add 220 grams of buttercream or 220 grams of sour cream. And use our hand mixer just to mix all of that together. And once that's done, all we need to do is cool that again, and this takes quite some time to cool as well, and as you can see there's a lot of it. So just cover that in plastic wrap and let it cool, and that's what we're going to be using as to cover our cake. And that means that we're almost done. We're almost at the assembly part. All we need to do is let that cool down. And in the meantime, I got a bit of a rise out of this cake, so I'm just cutting off the top so it flattens out a bit. And this is going to be our cake foundation. And then we're going to take the other piece and cut that in half, as I said before, so we still get a 3-layer cake. And all we need to do now is start cake assembly. And same thing for the other one. We are going to be cutting off the top so we flatten this out as much as possible. And then we're going to be using our piping bags, and same thing here. Matt says it's really necessary to use a piping bag and it makes a total difference. I don't think that it does. For choosing the piping bags, I used one that had too small of holes, so this took forever, and eventually I just removed the nozzle and just used the bags. And then it actually sped up quite a bit and was much easier to do. But alternating our two different cake fillings makes this looks very cool when you cut it, because you're gonna see a striped pattern in our cake. And this, as you can see, was quite hard work. I'm shaking a lot because it's so heavy to push. But eventually I figured that you could just remove that, and that made everything much easier. And I think they came up to temperature a bit as well, which made it more easier. And since we have a lot of filling, you can choose to use as much as you want. Then we're gonna do the same thing for our second filling layer. I think I did the opposite, so I started with the chocolate in the middle instead of the French buttercream. But as I said before, if I were to do this again, I would only use the French buttercream. And this is a long process making this cake. I think I did the sponge cakes on day 1, the fillings on day 2, and then the assembly on day 3. So I think it was a 3-day process or something like that. Once we put all of our layers there, we want to add some filling in the gaps so that it actually fills out, because we're going to be putting our chocolate ganache on this later on. We want a straight cake without any gaps. So use filling until it's goes all the way to the edge. And I didn't have patience enough to let the chocolate ganache cool enough. So I had to stop and put it in the fridge for a while until it was actually usable, because it just ran off the edges. So allowing your chocolate ganache to cool enough makes this much easier. And then all you need to do is add a rough layer on the exterior of the cake. Once that's done, we're going to be putting this in the fridge, allowing it to cool. And then if you have one of those, we're going to use a cake tool just to make a fancy pattern on it. I used a plastic one. That's not optimal, but it was cheaper, so I bought one of those. If I were to do that again, I would probably buy one of metal, because then you can rinse the metal in hot water, which means that it heats up and is much easier to work with. The plastic ones were not super simple to work with, and I also didn't get as smooth edges as I wanted to. That was try 1. I was not happy with that, so I added some more chocolate ganache and used a different pattern. And then I ended up with something looking like this, which was good enough, I would say. Those edges that stick up, all we need to do is just bring them towards the center of the cake. We're going to be hiding those with our chocolate drip that we're going to be making now. And that's 160 grams of chocolate. And this is the final thing. It makes the cake look super cool, and it's very easy to make. 95 grams of butter, and we're gonna be doing this bain marie. So pot of boiling water, place the bowl on top. You can use a metal one or a glass one, both works. Metal is a bit quicker. And melt the chocolate and the butter and mix that, and once that's melted, all we need to do now is allow that to cool down. and the temperature here depends on how much you want it to drip. I did it to 38 degrees. I think if you want it to drip slower and don't really run over the edges, you could go lower. But all we need to do now is pour this on top, and then we're gonna then carefully use our cake tool to bring that to the edges, and it's gonna drip down and set, and the chocolate is gonna firm up while it's dripping. And as you can see, once it got over the edge, for some parts it poured quite quickly. So maybe 37.5 degrees if you don't want it to go all the way, but that's easy to fix later. It's just remove those chocolate puddles at the bottom and it still looks great. And we're gonna be covering those edges with some chocolate flakes as well, so you won't see that anyway. Same for the edges, since we get edge markings, we're going to be covering that with some chocolate flakes as well. And once we've cleaned up our cake tray, it looks like this. And then we're going to be adding our chocolate flakes to cover up the mistakes we made. And that's it. It's quite a process, but it's a very good cake. And as I said, roughly 700 to 800 calories per slice, depending on how big you want them. So that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy.